Hello everyone, welcome to Daily News Simplified, the what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we are going to discuss the Hindu newspaper dated 17th of November 2019, Delhi edition. The articles which we'll discuss today are displayed on the screen. So let's start the discussion. So this article, What are the surveillance laws in India, has been taken from page number 14. This article talks about the current status of surveillance in India and relates it to the recent incident of Pegasus snooping on WhatsApp. Now, this particular issue of mass surveillance is related to three general studies papers. Starting with GS2, Governance, Constitution, Polity, Social Justice and International Relations, it is important from the perspective of role of civil services in a democracy. As you will know through this article, that the mass surveillance in India is majorly conducted by the bureaucrats or the civil services. So, in respect to that, it becomes important. As far as GS3 paper is concerned, we know that science and technology developments and their application and effects in everyday life. Now, mass surveillance or the surveillance by the state is conducted by technology, which have various implications on day-to-day life. So, it becomes important in that point of view. As far as GS4 ethics paper is concerned, syllabus has this line which is called ethical concerns and dilemmas in government and private institutions. The civil servants often face this dilemma of obeying the political executive with respect to the surveillance, and there this issue comes into play. So we'll start by first understanding what the mass surveillance is. Now, surveillance as a word means monitoring, and mass surveillance is a very particular term which implies monitoring by the state, to whom the state wants to monitor. Generally, state wants to monitor a group of people for their behavior, their activities and their movements. So as far as the behavior is concerned, state is always concerned about the stability and hence it wants to know the behaviors. Now, in order to maintain the internal security as well as external security, it is important to monitor the activities as well as the movement of the people. Now, it is important to realize that why mass surveillance is needed. Mass surveillance has a lot of advantages. First is fighting terrorism. We know that terrorist activities are not only impacting economic and political stability of various nations, but they are also impacting day-to-day life of normal citizens. So, for fighting terrorism, mass surveillance are also important for preventing crimes in the society. If we can trace and monitor the activities of various individuals, then the likelihood of crime decreases in the society, and hence this is another advantage. Then a lot of elements in the society which are known as antisocial elements try to create unrest, and we can track and stop them from doing it through surveillance. Now, there are a lot of disadvantages of surveillance as well. So, when the state acquires the power to monitor its citizens, it may violate the privacy of the citizens, because there has to be a limit up to which the state can go or should go in order to monitor the activities and movements of its citizens. Then, mass surveillance, as shown by the incidents in China, North Korea, and various other totalitarian regimes, it limits civil and political freedom. So, for example, main purpose of the mass surveillance is to stop social unrest and fighting terrorism as well as to prevent crimes. But what happens is that government often use this power to discredit not only the opposition but the factions of the citizens who are opposing the government in power. And another disadvantage of surveillance is that it leads to the genesis of surveillance state. Now, what is a surveillance state? A surveillance state is a country where the government engages in pervasive surveillance of large number of citizens and visitors. And this widespread surveillance is usually justified as being necessary for national security, such as to prevent crimes and acts of terrorism, but may also be used to stifle criticism and opposition to the government. We know that China is a surveillance state. It monitors and tracks not only movement of its citizens but also online presence and activities of all the residents of the China. They do it in order to maintain the communist government, Now we shall understand why the mass surveillance has become such a growing concern in our society today. As you shall know that in earlier times, mass surveillance was limited to the network of intelligence officials. They used to go out in the society and sought information from various sources. But with the advent of technology, the mass surveillance has become a very, very easy task. For example, we have a big data. This is a collection of massive amounts of data generated by the online activities of the individuals. Then, to analyze this big data, we have neural networks and artificial intelligence, which have made the analysis of this big data very easy. Now we have speech recognition and facial recognition softwares which make it extremely easy through the help of CCTV cameras to track the movement of the individuals. Then we also have smart cities. Now, these are not to be confused with the smart city scheme of the government of India, but in general, talking about smart cities across the world, we have widespread incorporation of information and communication technology within the daily life of urban residents, which results in increasing surveillance capacity of the states. Sometimes to the extent that individuals may be unaware of what information is being accessed, when the access occurs, and for what purpose. It is possible that such conditions could give rise to the development of electronic police state. For example, Shanghai, Amsterdam, San Jose, Dubai are cities which have integrated various surveillance technologies into their day to day functioning. Hence, this incorporation of or integration of information technology in almost all the affairs of the city management leads to increasing threat or the potential of its misuse. Let's now understand the mass surveillance in India. Mass surveillance in India is governed majorly by two acts: Indian Telegraph Act 1885 and Information Technology Act 2000. Indian Telegraph Act 1885 enables the government to intercept calls, which are telephone calls. It may be the landline calls or the mobile calls, any kind of calls. And Information and Technology Act 2000 enables the interception of data by the government. It is very important to understand this power of interception is given only to the government and not to the private agencies. So, for example, in India, if a private company providing the telecom services tries to intercept call, that is totally illegal. Only government has this power. And there is a set procedure to do that, which was given by Supreme Court in 1997 judgment, which said that surveillance requests have to be signed by an official who is at least the level of joint secretary. So, Government of India in Ministry of Home Affairs authorizes an official or a set of officials who cannot be less than the rank of joint secretary, which means they are really high officials. They will consider the requests of various agencies for surveillance, and then when they will sign this document, then the surveillance can be legally conducted. But there are certain problems with these rules and procedures of surveillance in India. Now, the first problem is that the surveillance in India is highly bureaucratized. What does that mean? It means that decisions about surveillance are taken by the executive branch of the government. The same executive branch also reviews the process. So, there is no parliamentary oversight as well as there is no judicial supervision as to how this surveillance process is being conducted. So, it may be the case that an individual will almost never know that he or she is being surveilled, and hence they will never be able to challenge before a court about the legality of their surveillance. So, this lack of oversight or the lack of scrutiny of this surveillance process is a cause for concern. The second and the very important issue regarding the surveillance in India is the vagueness and ambiguity in grounds of surveillance. For example, the grounds of surveillance have been directly taken from Article 19.2. As you know, that Article 19.2 provides the exception to the freedom of speech and expression. But there is also criticism for the criteria mentioned in Article 19.2 that they are very vague and ambiguous. Let's take an example here. In Article 19.2, the words which have been used are friendly relation with foreign countries, sovereignty and integrity of India. But there is no clear cut definition as to what are the items which are included in this, and the same terminologies have been included in Information and Technology Act, and hence this induces the vagueness in mass surveillance as well, as these criteria are very wide, vague and ambiguous, and government can justify almost each and every surveillance they are doing. The vagueness and ambiguity of grounds of surveillance makes our mass surveillance even more dangerous. And as a corollary to first and second issue is the third one, which is opaqueness. There is almost no information available about the basis on which surveillance decisions are taken and how the legal standards are applied. A 2014 RTI request revealed that on an average 250 surveillance requests are approved every day. This data shows that approval is just a rubber stamp on requests made by various agencies, and there is almost no deliberation as to whether this surveillance required by the agencies is needed or not. Now let's see what this article has to offer. You might be aware about a malware which is known as Pegasus, which is a software developed by an Israeli intelligence firm. Now, this malware was propagated through WhatsApp. WhatsApp uses end to end encryption technology, and this means that it is almost impossible to intercept a message in between. But through this Pegasus circulated through WhatsApp, the messages were decrypted. This led to WhatsApp filing the case against this Israeli cyber intelligence firm known as NSO. Now, why this becomes important in Indian context is because it compromised many phones of human rights activists, journalists, and lawyers in India. And there is an allegation that the government in India has also purchased this software in order to track certain individuals which mainly belong to activism. As far as the legality of this surveillance is concerned, we have read that under Indian Telegraph Act and Information and Technology Act, only Government of India is allowed to conduct mass surveillance. And under Section 43 and Section 66 of IT Act, hacking is strictly prohibited, and there are punishments laid down in the section for such a crime. There was this another incident where central government authorized 10 central agencies to conduct surveillance, which were basically dealing with intelligence and tax revenue like IB, CBI, Enforcement Directorate, Central Board of Direct Taxes, and which led to a lot of debate in India as to the creation of surveillance state in India. Now, analyzing the legality of any surveillance, Justice Puttaswamy versus Union of India case has given a landmark judgment by upholding the right to privacy as a fundamental right under Article 14, 19, and 21. So this case clearly held right to privacy as a fundamental right, that means which cannot be violated through law, and you can directly approach Supreme Court for remedies. But there was an exception created for surveillance, which is colloquially known as triple test. Supreme Court under Justice Puttaswamy versus Union of India case held that although right to privacy is sacrosanct, but still government is allowed to carry out mass surveillance in the country. But that mass surveillance will be justified if it satisfies three criteria. One, that mass surveillance should have legislative backing. Government can conduct mass surveillance, but only after legislating a law and giving itself a power to do mass surveillance through that legislation. Then government will have to justify a legitimate state purpose. So there has to be a purpose which should mandate the government to carry out surveillance, and government cannot carry out mass surveillance without any legitimate state interest. And that surveillance should be proportionate and it should not be too intrusive. Under this judgment, Supreme Court has clearly laid down these three criteria. Now, as the case is opening up, it needs to be seen whether this particular case of snooping is justified under various sections of the IT Act, and does it satisfy the criteria laid down in Justice Puttaswamy versus Union of India case. Let's now move on to the next article. So the next news is again taken from page number 14, and the title of the news is Fixing a Minimum Wage. Now, recently the President gave his approval to the Code on Wages 2019 that had earlier been passed by the Parliament. This is important from the perspective of both GS2 as well as GS3. Under GS2, that is Polity and Governance, minimum wages shall be covered under welfare schemes for vulnerable sections. As we know, oftentimes the people belonging to the lower stratas of the society are generally daily wage laborers, and hence their welfare is of extreme importance for us. Also, by ensuring minimum wage to each individual in the industry and society, we are ensuring inclusive growth, and that's why it becomes relevant for GS3 portion also. There is another reason why this is important. The economic growth or the industrial growth of the country has been held back due to the complexities of the labor laws. So, the simpler the labor laws will be, more investment will the country attract. Let's try and understand few basic concepts which are relevant for this topic. First is minimum wage and the second is living wage. Now, as we know that wage is something which is paid by the employer to the employee. Now, what is minimum wage? In India, minimum wage means legally mandate payment from employer or in the industry to workers irrespective of the ability of the employer to pay. It is legally mandated, which means there is a law which defines what should be the minimum wage in case of almost all the sectors, and it is not only legally mandated but there is a minimum payment, or you can say that there is a floor below which employers cannot pay if they are employing another individual for their services. Ideally, the minimum wage should provide for sustenance of life and preservation of the efficiency of the worker. That means minimum wage should be such that employee is not only able to survive but they are also able to work efficiently. Now, minimum wage as a concept is different from living wage, and it is important to know what is the main difference, because oftentimes various labor unions and activists demand that the criteria chosen for payment should not be minimum wage but rather it should be living wage. Now, living wage as a concept is minimum wage plus, which means that it already includes minimum wage, but there are certain other factors which are also included in it. Let's understand what are those. Apart from providing sustenance of life and preservation of efficiency of the worker, the living wage should also provide for human development of the worker as well as his or her family. So, for example, if there is a family of worker, then that worker should be able to afford education and health of his or her children. Then living wage should also provide for social needs of the workers, and it should also include safety nets, for example insurance and pension. And hence you can see that the concept of living wage is much wider than that of minimum wage. The point which should be noted here is that right now we are only concerned with minimum wage and not with the living wage. Now, before going into the features of the new law, it is important for us to understand why this change was needed. So, recently, Code on Wages 2019 was passed, which replaced four laws dealing with the minimum wage, which are Payment of Wages Act 1936, the Minimum Wages Act 1948, the Payment of Bonus Act 1965, and the Equal Remuneration Act 1976. So this new law is going to replace the four laws. So one of the major problems with the existing structure of minimum wage in Indian economy was that there were a lot of laws, and hence it created confusion and complexities for the employer as well as for the employee. Also, there was no uniformity among these four laws. A minimum wage for a particular sector was different in case of Payment of Wages Act 1936, and it was different in case of Minimum Wages Act 1948. So there was this lack of uniformity among various laws. Then there were issues related to gender discrimination. So, for example, minimum wages for the sectors dominated by the women were considerably lower as compared to the sectors dominated by men. A case in hand is that of a profession of a security guard and that of a domestic worker. In case of domestic worker, most of them are women, and their minimum wage is much lower as compared to that of a security guard, which are usually dominated by men. Then in the current structure of the minimum wages, there is this issue of coverage. The existing framework of the minimum wage provided by these four laws do not provide for the extensive coverage of all the professions and employments. There was also a problem with the compliance of the law. Especially when dealing with regular wage workers, the compliance of this act was extremely low. Let's now discuss the important provision of the code. As we know that code replaces four acts, which are Payment of Wages Act, Minimum Wages Act, Payment of Bonus Act, Equal Remuneration Act. Now, the first and the foremost benefit of the new code is that it has universal coverage. That is, the code will apply to all employees. The central government will make wage related decisions for employment such as railways, mines, and oil fields. Basically, all those fields which are under the union list, decision shall be taken by the union government, whereas in the rest of the cases, the decision shall be taken by the state governments. This code on wage provides for national minimum wage, which is floor wage linked to standard of living. According to the code, the central government will fix a floor wage taking into account living standard of workers. Further, it may set different floor wages for different geographical areas. Prices in the market vary according to the state, and hence this new code takes into account that possibility and hence allows for geographical variation. Now, as we have seen, floor rate shall be decided by the central government, which is the minimum payment which shall be given to the employee. And based on that, minimum wages shall be declared by both central as well as state government. But there is a condition that this minimum wage should be higher than the floor wage. It cannot go below the floor wage. There is also a provision for overtime which can be fixed by central and state governments. So the central and state government fix the number of hours that constitute a normal working day. Obviously, if the employee works in excess of the normal working day, they will be entitled to overtime wage, which must be at least twice that of wage rate or the minimum wage. Then there are other provisions related to how the payments of the wages will be done. Then it also provides the criteria on the basis of which the wages may be deducted from employees' salary. It prohibits discrimination in matters related to wages and recruitment of employees for the same work or work of similar nature. Now, the punishments of the penalties have also been given under the code and offences have been specified. Now, let's analyze the overall impact of the wage code. So first and the foremost is that it allows for the expansion of coverage. In the current framework, minimum wage was to be provided to only those employments which are listed in the schedule. And we know that in economy, the kind of employment scenario changes with time, and hence the introduction of new employment leads to the ambiguity of non-payment of the minimum wage. Now this code 2019 does away with the concept of bringing specific jobs under the act and mandates that minimum wages to be paid for all types of employments irrespective of whether they are in the organized or unorganized sector. By subsuming four different acts under one code, it will eliminate the confusion and the complexity, and it will be very beneficial for the economy. Then it will also need to better implementation as the procedure and the rules have been simplified and clearly written down, and simplification in itself leads to better implementation, as we have seen that it clearly removes the gender discrimination, and ultimately it will lead to improved standards of living for most people working in the industry. The impact which this code will create on the economy will be decided by the final floor rate which the central government has to decide. As we know that there could be different floor wages for different geographical areas, and hence the kind of floor which the center comes up with will decide the actual impact which this act will have. Now there are other issues with the act also. There is no provision of representation of trade unions in the wage fixation committee, which is very important, as for any other decision all the stakeholders must be consulted, and in case of minimum wages act, most important stakeholder is obviously labor, and lack of labor union will limit the effectivity of the final floor which is arrived at, as their recommendations shall not be included. Hence, we can see just the enactment of a law is not a cure for the problem. It needs to be seen that what the final floor rate which the central government comes up with, because that floor rate will decide the minimum wage which will be then set by the state and the central government, and then the government should also consider the request of trade unions to give them representation in the wage fixation committee, which will ultimately come up with the floor rate. With this, let's now move on to the next article. The next news is again taken from page number 14, and the heading of the news is, "What does the Places of Worship Act protect?" Now, the Supreme Court's Ram Janmabhoomi verdict repeatedly invoked the Places of Worship Special Provisions Act 1991, which seeks to maintain the religious character of holy structures as it was at the independence, which means that act prohibits the conversion of a temple, for example, into a mosque, or a mosque into a church, and vice versa. Now, although this particular act has a relevance for GS1 paper, which is Indian Heritage and Culture, as it talks about the preservation of the religious sites which are covered under Indian culture, and more than that, understanding the basic concept behind this act is important for full understanding of not only Ayodhya verdict but also the secular character of Indian state. Let's now understand what this act is all about. Now, the Places of Worship Act 1991 seeks to maintain the religious character of holy structures as it was at the time of independence. So, if a place was a mosque at the time of independence, it cannot be reverted back to an earlier structure, which, let's say, could be a temple or a church. In a nutshell, the act prohibits the conversion of a temple into a mosque and vice versa. But there are two issues in it. First is, if this is the provision of the act which does not allows retrogression of a site to earlier form of a religious site, then how come Supreme Court can order building up a Ram temple? Because that is against the provision of this law. And the second point is that if this act further conversion, then how come people are now raising other disputed sites, Mathura and Kashi masjids? Now we will understand it by understanding the objectives and provision of the act. Central thrust of the law is that the nature of place of worship cannot be changed and it will continue to be the same as it was on 15th of August 1947. The Supreme Court remarked that there are essentially two purposes the law seeks to fulfill. First, it prohibits the conversion of any place of worship. In doing so, it speaks to the future by mandating that the character of a place of public worship shall not be altered. So it's important to look at the section 3 and section 6 of the act. Section 3 of the act bans the conversion of a place of worship or even a section of it into a place of worship of a different religious denomination or of a different segment of the same religious denomination. So not only the religious conversion of the site is prohibited, but also the denominational conversion has been banned. And the second provision which is important from this perspective is section 6, which mandates a 3-year imprisonment and a fine for contravening the provision of section 3. Then the court also observed that the law seeks to impose a positive obligation to maintain the religious character of every place of worship as it existed on the day of the independence, which means it's the duty of the state of India to maintain the religious character of each site. That is why it has been called as positive obligation. So the natural doubt which should arise in your mind after reading these 2 points is that then how come Supreme Court allowed construction of a Ram temple? It is for a very simple reason that this act has only one exception, and that is the disputed site of Ayodhya temple. Act does not apply on Ayodhya dispute. As we know that the Ram Janmabhoomi dispute centers on the significance of a single site to two communities. On the one hand, Hindus claim that it was a birthplace of Lord Ram, while on the other hand, Muslims take claim on account of 16th century mosque that stood here until 1992. The site hosted a mosque at the independence, but the structure was demolished in 1992. However, the Places of Worship Act does not apply to Ram Janmabhoomi dispute and to any suit, appeal or proceedings related to it. So this act explicitly provides the status of exception to Ayodhya Ram Mandir site. And that is why Supreme Court has quoted this particular act in its judgment. According to Supreme Court, Places of Worship Act embodies the secular values of the Indian Constitution and strictly prohibits retrogression. So for example, in one of the principles of secularism is also that there should be inter-religious parity. That means state should not discriminate against any community but should not also favor any particular community. And retrogression means that restoring a site to its earlier status, which is the case with the Ayodhya Ram Temple movement. The law is hence a legislative instrument designed to protect the secular features of the Indian polity as we know that Indian history is inundated with the events in which one or the other religious site were demolished. And if the people start demanding retrogression, which means restoration, then almost all the religious site will have to be changed. And hence, non retrogression is a foundational feature of the fundamental constitutional principles. Supreme Court also gave a statement which is very important from Main's point of view, is that historical wrongs cannot be remedied by people taking the law into their own hands. Now the question arises of future movements. Now few right-wing groups have raised the issue of mosque at Mathura and Kashi Hindu religious places. Now by this discussion it must be clear to you that it's legally untenable, as this act only provides exception to Babri Masjid or the Ayodhya Ram temple site. Now further movements for other sites will not be entertained by the courts, and hence it will preserve the secular character of the Indian state. Let's now move on to the next article. This next news, Wasteland conservation threatens livelihoods, ecological balance, has been taken from page number 11. This article talks about how and why wasteland conversion into other land uses is actually harming the society. Before we go into discussing the main points raised in this article, it's important to understand the relevance. As we know that under General Studies paper 3, we have conservation, environmental pollution and degradation, and environmental impact assessment are covered. And hence, this news becomes important from that perspective. In this discussion, we will understand what a wasteland is and what is the difference between barren wasteland and cultivable wasteland. Then, we will look into the main reasons because of which the conversion of wasteland is taking place in the country. And finally, we will analyze the impact of this conversion. Let's start with the news from where the data of the wasteland conversion has been taken up. So, Wasteland Atlas was prepared in collaboration with National Remote Sensing Center and released by Land Resources Department. Now, this become extremely important to memorize that who is the agency in the country which prepares wasteland. This becomes important from the perspective of prelims exam because there is a difference between preparation of record and the releasing or the publishing of the record. So the publishing is done by Department of Land Resources, whereas the preparation of the atlas is done by National Remote Sensing Center. Then comes the question of how does this take place. Land Resources Department uses satellite data to measure the extent of 23 different types of wastelands and tracks the impact of reclamation efforts. There is a wasteland and people and government are trying to encroach upon or trying to make use of that wasteland, and through satellite data this conversion of wasteland into productive use is being tracked, and that atlas has been prepared known as Wasteland Atlas. Now as far as the definition of wasteland is concerned, the land which may be classified as wasteland such as barren, hilly terrain, desert lands, ravines. So normally the definition of wasteland is derived from its ability to be utilized for agriculture. So normally a land which is not fit for cultivation with the available technology will be categorized as wasteland. And all those areas which can be agriculturally productive with the help of present technology will not be categorized as wasteland. We know that it is very difficult to cultivate in hilly areas or desert areas or in ravines and gully infested areas, and those are categorized as wastelands. Now there is another category which is called culturable wasteland. Culturable wasteland is actually not a wasteland, but it is a land which has been left fallow for more than 5 years. This is a criteria which you should memorize and remember. It is important to note here that culturable wasteland can be brought under cultivation with the existing technology, although for some reason it is lying fallow. So this article raises the issue of conversion of wasteland into other uses, and we will see that why this conversion is taking place. So the first and the foremost reason is government initiatives are the leading cause of conversion of wasteland into other uses. As we know that India holds 18% of the world's population and it has only 2.5% of the land area. And hence, you can easily derive from this that there is an acute pressure on land in India and we need to reclaim more and more land. So government in some areas is actively promoting this conversion of wasteland into other land uses. Then we also know that we need to ensure food security. There is an urgent need to improve the productivity of existing cultivated lands and to bring additional land under the cultivation. So, various efforts are being taken to either increase the area under irrigation or to use other technologies such as drought resistant seed varieties so that we can increase the food production from the culturable wasteland. Then there are a lot of varieties of trees which can be planted over wastelands and can survive in those conditions. By doing this, we are increasing the carbon sink and hence it will help in our efforts against global warming. This is known as climate change mitigation. Besides the above factors mentioned, there is also productive utilization for economy. For example, setting up of solar power plants on wasteland is being actively encouraged by Rajasthan and Gujarat state governments. This is leading to beneficial electricity production through renewable resources. Then there are a lot of industries which are coming up over wastelands. And because agricultural productivity of the land is not related to the industrial production which can take place over that area, and hence it is being actively encouraged. Then there are also illegal encroachment by local residents resulting into conversion of wasteland. But we can also ask that all these things are extremely important for our country. Then why are some people opposing this conversion of wasteland? Let's look into this matter in detail and understand why this is a matter of concern. Before we understand the impact of conversion of wasteland, we will take up a case study of Rajasthan. A net change of 4,803 square kilometer was seen in Rajasthan. That means that around 5,000 square kilometer of wasteland has been converted into other uses, and mainly those areas which contain scrub and sands have been brought under cultivation. And another cause of this conversion has been the production of renewable energy, as we have discussed. Also, Uttar Pradesh and Bihar have seen high levels of conversion. So, it is not just areas containing desert regions which are actively participating in the conversion of wasteland, but Bihar and UP are also not far behind. Let's now understand the impact of converting the wastelands. Now, as we know, that these wastelands have a sparse vegetation and mainly grasslands. These grasslands are extremely important from the perspective of pastoral communities which depend on common grazing land for their livelihood. As they tame large number of animals, they need large areas with grasses. But if these areas would be converted into other uses, they will be left to themselves as they do not have any land. Next impact is on environment. As we know that biodiversity is extremely habitat specific and wastelands are also a kind of habitat which protect and nourish a unique biodiversity. So by eliminating those wastelands, we are eliminating this biodiversity. There is another perspective to this which relates to disaster management. Now, marshland, as we know, are wastelands which cannot be cultivated, but the encroachment of marshlands removes the sink of extra water which could have been carried into the marshlands, as reflected in recent Kerala flooding, which happened because marshland was treated as a waste rather than a valuable buffer. So, had Kerala protected its marshlands, the extra water from the extra rain could have gone into marshland, would have not affected Kerala in such a devastating manner. Then, backwaters, which are quite a common phenomena as far as inundated coastline of western coast of India is concerned, they protect inland water resources from encroaching salinity and seawater inundation, as well as they store of water for dry seasons. As we know that in coastal areas, due to excessive removal of groundwater, the saline water from the sea intrudes into our groundwater reservoirs. But if we have a lot of backwaters, their water pressure stops this flow of salinity towards ground and hence protect the characteristic of potable water which is fit for drinking. Hence, the activists have raised this issue that such a conversion endorses a hierarchical idea of livelihood, as it reflects that pastoralists are less productive than a farmer. That's why government is trying to convert wasteland into agriculturally productive areas. And they are also raising the issue of environmental conservation, biodiversity conservation, as well as flood protection. There is also an issue of groundwater conservation. So, this article presents another perspective of environmental conservation, and it demonstrates the unique importance of wastelands in our lives. Let's now move on to the next article. Next, we are going to discuss the disease of tuberculosis. There are two articles which have been published today in the Hindu newspaper. The first article is about Kerala on track to eliminate TB by 2025, which is published on page number 8. And the next article is CTB, new diagnostic tool for detecting tuberculosis, which is published on the page number 15, which is the science page. Before we go further and understand the tuberculosis as a disease and its preventive methods, as well as the government schemes related to tuberculosis, it's important for us to understand why are we reading this news. Although these diseases have not been mentioned directly into the topic, every year UPSC has asked question related to diseases. This question is a case in point where UPSC asked about H1N1 disease, which was in news a lot in 2015. Similarly, other diseases have also been asked in the examination. So, it's important to understand the various aspects of tuberculosis. Let's try and address what tuberculosis is. As you can see, tuberculosis is an airborne communicable disease. Communicable disease, which means that it is transferable from one person to another. And airborne means that it can be transmitted through air route. So, for example, if a person coughs, sneezes, or spits, the bacteria from those coughing and sneezing can be directly inhaled by the other person, which is a receiver, and can develop this disease. Although it is not certain that the other person will definitely develop the disease. It is extremely important to memorize that the bacteria which causes TB is known as Bacillus mycobacterium. An important question which can be asked is, why is tuberculosis commonly impacts the lungs or the pulmonary system? So there is an interesting thing about mycobacterium bacillus is that they grow in those parts of the body where the supply of oxygen and blood is high. And obviously you can derive from here, lung is that area where supply of both oxygen and blood are in highest quantities. Although TB is not limited to just lungs but infects other organs as well, and which are brain, uterus, stomach, mouth, kidneys, bones, and this kind of TB is known as extrapulmonary TB. As we have discussed, the mode of transmission is airborne. There are certain conditions which increase the chances of TB. Once a person acquires this bacteria, Bacillus mycobacterium, it does not lead to the disease immediate. There are certain conditions which increases the chances of development of this disease, and those mainly deal with the immune compromise condition. For example, the person infected with HIV will have his or her immune system compromised, and hence as the bacteria is inhaled immediately leads to the development of TB, and that's why we have a lot of co-infection of HIV with TB, and hence the government guidelines mandate HIV tests when a person is diagnosed with TB. Then another condition is undernutrition. Diabetes is another such disease which increases the likelihood of TB disease. Smoking as we know infects lungs and impacts the alveoli, which makes it easier for the Bacillus mycobacterium to enter into the blood cells. Now, talking about diagnosis of TB, this is one of the challenges in case of tuberculosis, as early diagnosis of TB is extremely difficult, as TB remains in a latent state for a very long time in a person's body and does not show any symptoms, and hence it becomes very difficult to identify it. Very commonly used very commonly used diagnosis method is sputum smear microscopy, which studies phenotype of the pathogen from the sputum sample of the infected patient. But this test can only be conducted after the person has developed significant signs of TB, which is 2 to 3 weeks of consecutive coughing. Now, the challenges of this technique is that it has a very low sensitivity and it cannot detect drug resistant pathogen. Now, drug resistance is a recent problem as far as fighting tuberculosis is concerned, which means that the commonly used antibiotics have become inefficient as far as the treatment of TB is concerned. Let's now talk about prevention and treatment of tuberculosis disease. There is a limited prevention against TB and that is only used for children. This vaccine is known as BCG. It is important to note that there is no effective vaccines for adults. As far as treatment is concerned, WHO recommends DOTS, which is directly observed treatment short course for effective treatment of TB. It not only includes recommendation of antibiotics, but it also mandates financial commitment, early diagnosis, and uninterrupted supply of high quality anti TB drugs. Most commonly used treatment for TB is rifampicin, an antibiotic. Let's now analyze this disease with respect to India. Starting with incidence of TB in India. India is the country with the highest incidence of TB in the world. Also, it leads to high mortality, which is around 199 people per lakh of population. Obviously, government has taken the disease of TB at high priority and government runs various programs for its elimination. The first and the foremost is National TB Control Program, which is ongoing since 1962. But there are obviously issues related to the functioning of the program. That's why we have not been able to eliminate the TB disease. Then we have revised National TB Control Program, which is known as RNTCP, which was adopted in 97 after WHO declared TB as the global epidemic in 1993. So now the main focus has been shifted to early diagnosis and treatment in accordance with DROTS strategy suggested by WHO. A very important news from the perspective of 2020 prelim as well as main examination is National Strategic Plan for TB Elimination 1725. WHO released TB elimination strategy aligned with SDG of United Nations. India immediately followed suit and adopted this strategy and named it National Strategy Plan for TB Elimination. It has four pillars: detect, which is extremely important, then treat, then treatment also helps in prevention of disease transmission, and then we have to build up infrastructures to enable that all three happens. Four main targets of National Strategic Plan for TB Elimination 2017 and 2025 is 80% reduction in TB incidence by 2025. So for example, if in 2019 we have 100 cases, by 2025 we should only have 20 new cases every year. 90% reduction in TB mortality. So let's say out of 100 people who have been detected with TB, 40 will die. So this should be reduced to around only 4 by 2025. And the last target is extremely important, which deals with financial support to be provided to the TB patients, is that by 2025 no patient will have to bear the financial cost of fighting this disease of TB. Other steps include stepping up RNTCP. Then government has created Nikshay portal. It is very important from the prelims point of view, which supplies quality anti-TB drugs. Government is now actively engaging with the private sector, as we know that a lot of patients directly go to the private sector for the treatment of TB. Through this, they move out of the surveillance of the government of India. And now the private sector has been mandated to provide the information to the government related to each and every new patient of TB, because government wants to keep track of the patients who have been infected. Government has also launched medicine till end and nutrition till end strategy, as we have seen that people who are malnutrition are more likely to get infected, and some of the patients stop the medicine before its full term is over. So government through its various health officials like Anganwadi workers and Ashas keeps the track whether the TB patients are being administered medicine properly. Now let's understand that why India has not been able to eliminate TB. As we know that India contributes around 27% of the global TB burden, there are three main factors which are a hindrance towards TB free India. The first one is diagnostic delays, second one is low level of notification, and third one is economic burden. This is very important to understand from the perspective of mains examination because question can be framed. It is very important to understand these three factors from the perspective of mains examination because it can be asked that despite so many efforts being taken, why is India not being able to eliminate the disease of TB from the society? As far as diagnostic delays are concerned, the average time between infection and reporting is around 4 months, which is a massive delay for such a deadly disease. So, early diagnosis is the key for TB elimination. Now, here comes the article which is published in the newspaper today, CTB, where a new device has been invented by Jamia Millia Islamia, which will rapidly reduce the time taken for detection and help in early detection. Moving on to the next factor which leads to the increase of TB incidence is lower level of notification. As we just discussed that it is mandatory for the healthcare facilities to report all new cases of TB to the government, but out of 2.69 million cases only 2.15 million were reported, leaving a gap of around 5.5 lakh unreported cases. This is mainly due to the lack of reporting from the private sector. As we know that the treatment of the TB is prolonged, ranging from 1 year to 2 years and many times more than that. And hence there is a lot of monetary cost which is involved in the treatment. Also, the drugs required for the treatment of multi-drug resistant bacteria, which are bedaquiline and delaminid, they are extremely expensive and hence they become massive economic burden on the patient's family. With this, we come to the end of discussion of today's newspaper. Let's now consider questions for preliminary examination. Now let us take up some questions for preliminary examinations. Consider the following statements regarding tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is a viral disease. This is clearly wrong as it is a bacterial disease. Second option is people with HIV are considered high risk group to contract the disease, which is correct. The second question is in recent Puttaswamy judgment, the Supreme Court recognized right to privacy to be part of fundamental right under which of the following provisions of the Constitution? Article 14 is correct. Article 15 is wrong, Article 19 is correct, and Article 21 is also correct, and hence 1, 3, and 4 are contained in option C, and hence the right answer is C. Let's take up two more questions for the preliminary examinations. Consider the following statements. Culturable wastelands are permanent wastelands. This is clearly wrong, as culturable wastelands can be converted into productive assets through investments. Wastelands are not rich in biodiversity. This is also incorrect as they have significant amount of biodiversity and hence both of the answers are incorrect and hence the right answer is D. The last question for the day is what is the purpose of LIGO project? To detect neutrinos, to detect gravitational waves, to detect effectiveness of missile defense system or to study the effect of solar flares on our communication systems? Correct answer is B. To detect gravitational waves. With this, we conclude this discussion. Let's take up the question for the day.